Amen and good evening. Ever heard of D.L. Moody? D.L. Moody, he died right at the end of the 19th century, 1899, somewhere in there. I was researching a quote that I learned and that I've said from this pulpit back to him as maybe the original source about the life of Moses. You've heard it maybe a different way from the pulpit here. D.L. Moody supposedly said it this way: Moses spent 40 years thinking he was a somebody, 40 years learning he was a nobody, and then 40 years, and this is an interesting verse, 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. So maybe you've heard it slightly different, but that was D.L. Moody. And yet D.L. Moody in the 19th century was not the first one to preach about Moses and to divide out his life into these three evenly divided segments of 40 and 40. Stephen in the first century, the deacon Stephen, preached about Moses, and that's where we typically turn in the book of Acts to see specifically these 40 segments of the life of Moses. This was relatively shortly after being ordained a deacon there in chapter 6 that Stephen preaches, and part of his preaching was in response to charges of him blaspheming Moses, which is interesting. They suborned men which said, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God." Interesting the order they put. They put Moses before God. Now, we're more concerned about blaspheming our religious forefather than God himself. "For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered us." Interesting word there, the customs, as opposed to just the law of God, the law of Moses. So I find it interesting as you then go into chapter 7 of the book of Acts, when Stephen begins to preach, part of his preaching is basically to say, you want to talk about Moses? I'll tell you about Moses. But he starts off rehearsing the history of the patriarchs, the beginning of chapter 7 of Acts. I know we're going to get back to Exodus here. But then around in verse 17 of Acts 7, he begins to preach about Moses. Verses 20 and 21, Stephen preaches about the birth of Moses, at which time Moses was born and was exceeding fair, a good-looking baby, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. We'll see in a bit here. Maybe you already know that the name Moses means to be drawn out. The daughter took him up, drew him out of the water. In the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11, it speaks of Moses and his parents. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child. Again, this means literally he was a good-looking baby. Aren't all babies beautiful? That's for you to answer. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. What was the commandment? Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river." They said, "We're not afraid of that. This is a good-looking baby. We're going to keep him." They had faith. That was written in the Hall of Faith. The child grew. Reading back in Exodus chapter 2, and she, being his birth mother, Jochebed, her name means the Lord is glory. That's a wonderful name. She brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. Here we go once again. She said, "Because I drew him out of the water." And that interesting meaning of his name, kind of, if you have that in your mind, it comes back again and again as the historical narrative continues. Well, back to Stephen's preaching, there's this pivot point then after 40 years, the initial 40 years of the life of Moses. And this comes picking up in verse 23, and I'm going to read a little bit here. Verse 23 of Acts chapter 7, "And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. I wonder why. He was 40 years in Pharaoh's household, more Egyptian than an Israelite. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren, why do ye wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? The answer to that is God. From Romans 13 and verse 1, the powers that be are ordained of God. But it was meant to be rhetorical. Well, wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat two sons. Two sons. Who were those two sons? First one was Gershom. His name means stranger or refugee or foreigner. Moses was content to dwell with a man. He gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter, and she bare him a son, and called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. So his one son means stranger. And then in Exodus chapter 18, we read of his other son, Eleazar. The name of the other one was Eleazar, and then we understand the meaning of his name. For the God of my father said, He was mine help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So interesting, Moses just setting the stage for a particular part of his life that we're going to hone in on. His one son meant stranger. He was a stranger, but as a stranger in a strange land, his other son's name was God is mine help. So if you feel like this world's not your home, you're just passing through, you're a stranger in this land, remember God is your help. They're the two sons of Moses. Kind of a helpful thought. Well, then we get to pivot point number 2. This would be after the first 40-year chunk, now the second 40-year chunk of his life. We're at age 80, Moses is, and that picks up around verse 30 of Acts chapter 7. And when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. When Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight. Did it look like the slide? I don't know. This is probably AI artwork, just typing in Moses burning bush. It's amazing the pieces of art that you see. I picked a somewhat a tame one. When Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight, and as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him. Again, Moses spent 40 years thinking he was a somebody. He was Pharaoh's grandson. And grandchildren are pretty special. You grandparents out there know that. And I was thinking about even the President of the United States. He almost looks like a normal guy when he's around his grandchildren. You see some video clips, he looks like just a grandpa sometimes. And then he gets away from them and spouts off his mouth. But so 40 years thinking he was somebody, growing up in Pharaoh's household. 40 years learning he was a nobody. Growing up essentially as an Egyptian, he learned their thought that all shepherds were an abomination. So think about 40 years growing up, walking like an Egyptian, talking like an Egyptian, and then all of a sudden he has 40 years of being that which was considered an abomination from the culture in which he grew up. That's pretty humbling. And then the final 40 years after those two periods of preparation, 40 years discovering that God can really use a nobody, a very humbled, faithful man, year after year after year. So it is this pivot point from the second section of his life to the third that draws our attention tonight, and we'll finish up here in the book of Acts with Stephen's preaching about this historical example, and then we'll go back to Exodus and read a bit of it ourselves. Stephen says, as he drew near to behold it, this sight, this image, the voice of the Lord came unto him. It's almost as if James chapter 4, verse 8 is true. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Do you find it kind of intriguing as he just went to look at this sight that then the voice of God came out and spoke to him directly and called his name? Do you find it not just interesting from a historical perspective, thinking about Moses, but intriguing, desirable, passionately desirable, maybe for you as an individual, to see something of God, to turn to investigate and draw near and have him call out your name. And maybe you didn't think you heard it right the first time, so he immediately calls it out again. Does that intrigue you to have God speak to you directly from whatever the burning bush might be? So we go back to Exodus now, where Stephen really was preaching from, a passage he was obviously familiar with and reminded of the Holy Spirit. And we have this key, I will now, the title for the message tonight, I will now turn aside. If you join me back there in Exodus, I'll turn, I'm so done with Acts, no. For the message tonight, I'm done with Stephen's preaching, and I'll get back with you in Exodus now, chapter 3. We'll read just the first 4 verses. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here am I. You can insert the tone of his voice or the expression as you might imagine it. Looking and beholding a great sight, as he was doing, is not the same as then turning aside to further investigate the cause. Who is this creator that caused this incredible sight, and then having him speak directly to you? There's a difference between turning aside and doing that and seeing this great sight and just kind of going, that's neat, and walking on. You miss out on the whole Moses, God speaking directly to you. So there is a macro transition here from one season of life of Moses to another, 40 years to 40 years. And think about that as this season of testing prepared him for this season of testing. Why do you keep saying testing? The number 40, as many are familiar with, throughout the Scriptures. Some numbers, kind of like you're standing off on your left foot and squinting your eyes to come up with some aspects of numerology. 40 is pretty clear. I mean, 40. I'll not list examples of testing. I'll just continue to refer to them. So this 40 years of testing, 40 years of testing, 40 years, and this middle 40 years of testing was shepherding four-legged creatures year after year after year after year, day after day, doing the aspects of shepherding, feeding them, watering them, keeping them, leading them. Kind of sounds like a pastor and a bishop and an elder all wrapped into one. The pastoring, feeding and watering. It says back in chapter 2, verse 19, he watered the flock. This is when some of the daughters came out. Then the keeping of the flock, the bishop aspect of oversight, protecting the flock. Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And then the leading of the flock, the eldership, leading the flock to the backside of the desert. So interesting, he was somewhat fulfilling the roles with four-legged creatures of shepherding, of pastoring, and overseeing them and leading them, that he would then do these final 40 years, not with four-legged creatures, but with the flock of God. He did it first with his father-in-law in one place called Jethro here in chapter 3, which means his excellence. He has another name he's referred to back in chapter 2 and verse 18, his father-in-law, Reuel, or however, sounds like I've had something to drink. Reuel. I don't know how it's pronounced, but I know what it means. It means friend of God. Friend of God. Interesting. So that period of life, preparing him to transition to this next stage of life, shepherding seen as an abomination by the culture in which he grew up in, then shepherding the flock of God, exactly what God wanted him to be doing. But on a more micro level, we're going to take this transition from 40 years to 40 years and hone in on this little micro aspect of that to limit ourselves somewhat. This transition from simply looking at a great sight, just something in nature, something only God could do, general revelation of God as the creator in his creation. In transitioning from that, turning, investigating and further, and hearing the special revelation of God's word in his ears just for him. Moses, again, Moses with the proper response, at least initially. Here am I. Not like we sang, which was drawn more from Isaiah 6:8. Here am I, Lord, send me. It could have been another song that we sang. Here am I, Lord, send me. Da-na-na-na-na-na, here am I, Lord, send me. He wasn't exactly responding in that fashion. He just said, here am I, because his name was called twice. He at least acknowledged that God was speaking to him. We can at least do that, acknowledge when God gets our attention and we turn to investigate further, at least acknowledge that he's speaking to us, calling us by name. God's speaking to all y'all tonight through the preacher preaching his word. But that's a little bit different than acknowledging the times when God is calling you out by name. And in my mind, as I was preaching this, I was going to look at everyone and start calling out people's names. I thought that might make them feel uncomfortable. Does it make you feel uncomfortable when God really does call your name? How do you respond? Does he have to immediately follow up and say, hey, and get your attention? Well, I don't want to get to that point to listen to him when he calls out my name, because he might tell me to do something I don't want to do or I don't think I can do. I might get to the point where Moses did, where he says, but, who am I that I should go into Pharaoh and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? Sometimes we're so afraid to get to the point and listen to what he might have for us to do that we don't even turn aside and give him the chance to speak. We simply kind of cock our head and raise an eyebrow and go, that's interesting. Look at that. It's burning, but it's not being consumed. Huh. Imagine that. we just keep on walking. So here's the outline, honing in on just the title there. I will now turn aside. Here are 3 points. I will. Speaking of a choice. Now, speaking of a time, turn aside. Speaking of an action. And I believe tonight God could speak to you from his word and take you from where you are to where he wants you to go. And a very unique service he has just for you, if you might grab hold of this example we have in our text tonight. So I will, very simply, these points, I will, a choice, volition. We do believe God is not so sovereign that he did not give us an ability to make decisions. The choice here, a choice to not view the supernatural as just blasé, and note with passing interest, emphasis on just the passing by. Let's make this really real. Was not Moses intimately familiar, if you think about this, with fires? 40 years as a shepherd. I just asked myself that. Do you think he ever made a fire to cook his food? Do you think he ever made a fire tending Jethro's flocks to keep warm? No, I didn't Google the climate in Midian and where this was and the geography. I just said at times it was probably cold, and even if it was hot during the day, if he's at any elevation at all, he needed a fire. Maybe a fire to protect the flock from the predators. And I did Google that, because you think about, oh, there are lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, out there. I'm going to build a big fire and have that keep the wild animals at bay. My friends were hiking in Yellowstone. I've told you this story. And a grizzly bear came into their camp. And when he finally left, after sniffing around and eating their food and not biting into them, thankfully, they built up the fire. This was early to mid-evening. They hadn't gone to bed yet. And so I looked up, does fire really keep wild animals away? And the internet answer was pretty much, unless they're really hungry, and then they don't care. They're going to come in and just snack. But back to, do you think he was familiar with sitting around and watching a fire? I thought, I bet every single day of his life for 40 years. And I could be off by a fire or two. But I thought about that. And if you sit and look at a lot of fires, we did recently, we haven't used our fire pit for a while since the kids moved away. But a bunch of folks were in town, of course, for the holidays. And a couple of son-in-laws said, hey, can we build a fire? And I said, that'd be great. There's a bunch of wood back there. Go for it, and I'll just come back and enjoy it once you have it built. And I remember just sitting there as they were taking my wood pile and chopping it up and making it smaller, and they just kept feeding the fire, feeding the fire, feeding the fire, because it kept getting smaller, and you had to keep feeding it. What if you did that every single day to cook, and every single night to keep warm, and to keep the wild animals away from eating Jethro's sheep or goats or whatever he had? Would you get kind of used to having to find wood to make your fire and find wood to keep it going, especially if you're moving around different places to find grass for the flocks to eat? You say you're belaboring the point. Not really. It's to drive into our heads what was driven into Moses' heads. He had looked at a lot of fires. He had fed a lot of fires. And so he would look at that for a little bit, just stare at that fire. And would it not, after 40 years, dawn on him, I'm not putting anything in there. No one else is putting anything in there. But it's not dwindling. And we have a fire triangle, he was probably thinking. Oxygen, heat, fuel. So there was something very familiar in his life that God used, all that to get to this point, that God used to draw his attention. It wasn't just, hey Moses, look over here. It was, I'm going to use something that he sees every day, and he'll notice something's different, that this fire is supernatural. And I'm just wondering what might be so familiar to you day after day, year after year, 40 years of some period of testing in your life that God might use in front of you to just show you that he's trying to get your attention. Maybe you're a fisherman out in the South Pacific, night after night after night, and you just look up and God used that familiarity, just randomly throwing out an example, use that familiarity of just seeing what the stars are like out away from everything, except maybe a little light on the tuna boat there. And he used that to get your attention and just wanted you to draw closer and investigate further, that he might speak directly to you and almost as if it was real, call out your name and tell you what he wanted to do in your life. What might that be for you? You see it as just, I got to build another fire so I can cook my gruel. I got to build another fire because it's going to be really cold tonight. I can already feel, and year after year, and yet whatever that might be in your life that just seems like this ongoing routine, you're so familiar with it, you can tell instantly when something is different. Hey, this is supernatural. This is not what I've seen over and over and over again. What might that be in your life? And then, are you then willing to deliberately choose? This is I will, a choice. Are you willing to then choose to move beyond mere looking at this wonder, to make this decision again, to turn aside, to investigate further? It requires a choice. I will. Now it requires timing. And I thought about things that I've put off in my life in terms of figuring out transitions from one block of life, not 40 years, but 20 years. Does that resonate with any retired Navy guys in here? Maybe a 20-year block, or 30 for some if you're super motivated. A 20-year block in my life, and I knew at some point that season was going to end and there was going to be something out there, and I didn't know what that something was, what I would be transitioning to. And people would ask, and I just kind of, whatever, I'll figure that out. And God I used the pastor of this church at the time to pin me down on that and say, "Are you called to preach?" Manana, I'll figure that out when I'm out of the Navy. And he encouraged me to go investigate further, turn aside, call closer to God, and listen to God. Not say Moses, Moses, but Timothy, Timotheus. That's what my mom did to get my attention, and maybe that's what God did. But we tend to put things off. This was the culmination of a lengthy season of testing in Moses' life. And God determined that the season's purpose was complete, not in year 20 or 25 or 39, 40 years of testing and preparation and preparing Moses for what lied ahead. And after God determined that the current season in Moses' life was complete, he then again went to use something very familiar with Moses to get his attention. And then the Lord waited. He does this supernatural sight in front of Moses, and he didn't immediately start calling, "Hey, Moses, Moses." He just put it out there, and he waited to see if Moses would make the decision to turn aside. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, there's this implied word "then" that I hear in my mind. Then God called unto him. And maybe in your life, God's just waiting. He's got that thing, whatever it is, in front of you, and you're kind of looking at it, but God's just waiting for you to make the decision to now turn aside, that then he can call your name and start speaking to you and telling you what he has in store for you for the next season of life. Now speaks of a time. Are you willing to align your timeline with God's? And to do so without delay. The Bible warns a lot against procrastination. Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. Proverbs 27, verse 1, several other passages along those lines. Generically speaking, putting it all together, the Bible warns of making God's today your tomorrow, which can sadly, tragically turn into your never. Now speaks of a time. And turn aside speaks of an action. You can make a decision, you can tell people you've made a decision, but talk is cheap. What if Moses said he would turn aside but never did? I have decided to follow Jesus. I've made that decision to turn and investigate further as I keep walking right on by and never hear the Lord talk to me. I don't think that's the way the hymn is sung. In all labor there is profit, but the talk of the lips tendeth only to penury. That is extreme poverty. And that's Proverbs 14 and verse 23. So what if Moses was all talk? He said he made a decision but didn't follow through. Well, that would be tragic. What if? We could what if the whole Bible. We could what if it more for ourselves, which I guess is the point tonight. But Moses had a testimony, going back to Stephen preaching about Moses. He had a testimony of not just being a talker, but being a doer. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. That's kind of putting us in the first 40 years of his life. And was mighty in words and in deeds. That's back in Acts chapter 7, verse 22. Stephen's preaching. Interesting because it's New Testament. It's written in the Greek. And so words and deeds, logos and ergon. Mighty in words, speaking, expression, and in deeds. Ergon, the work, the labor. So I appreciate that about Moses. He didn't just say he had made a decision. Yep, God's called me to do such and such. Yep, I'm going to investigate that further. He actually followed through with his actions. And so we are to let our actions speak. He did turn aside. And what does that mean for us in application in a more figurative sense? Well, I know this. I've seen it in my life. Maybe you can relate yourselves. Continuing down the same path, absent any course corrections, is not turning aside. Doom to 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 doom. Just never even being aware that God is like, hey, look at this. This is something you should understand. I have this just for you. Well, if I never actually follow through and turn aside, I'm really not taking the actions I need to. You could be in the middle of a season of testing and preparation. You could be in year 20 of 40 years. You could be at the end of such a season. You could be right on the cusp of God wanting to transition you into something else. And he's trying to get your attention. Well, how can you tell the difference? How do you know? Where am I? Well, I know this. Just constantly making course corrections, apart from God giving clear directions, may simply be the instability of changing lanes prompted solely by emotions and reasoning. Shiny object, squirrel, So there is a sense of, if you're here, and God made it clear you're here, don't seek to constantly transition if he's doing something in your life to prepare you for what's next. Let him continue to prepare you. But I believe he'll make it clear when you're here, ready to transition through something that you would be familiar with in your life, but you'll see, ooh, this isn't just 40 years of normal. There's something different here. I better turn in and investigate. When God is begging your attention, please do turn aside and draw nigh to him, and he will draw nigh to you, as the half-brother of the Lord said, again, James 4:8. And so labor in his word and listen to his call. There's a pattern here in this transition, this micro transition, not kind of the broad one, but right here, the transition from seeing something just broadly of God and transitioning to investigating further, leaning in, turning aside, and hearing him call and speak directly to us. That's going from just kind of a broad general revelation of God, sometimes just through his creation, the stars in the South Pacific, the fire here, transitioning from that to the special revelation of the Word of God and him using that and speaking through that to your called name. This principle was turned into a song by King David, the sweet psalmist of Israel. It was given to the chief musician of Israel. It's Psalm 19, and we've preached on that before. It starts off, the heavens declare the glory of God, and we've seen that last few nights. A little bit of clouds rolling in, I guess, starting last night, but several clear nights for almost a week. And sure enough, the heavens declare the glory of God. It's almost like I was fighting with my wife. It's my turn to take the dog out once it got dark. I want to see the stars. Not really. If she was willing, I'd let her go if it was her turn. But when it was my turn and got out there and look up, and I found myself just like black dog. I don't know where the dog is, but those stars are amazing. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork, as it starts off. And everyone can see the general revelation of God the Creator through his creation. Romans 1 tells us that. There's no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. But then in that psalm, we have this principle of going from just, wow, look at the Creator, he's amazing, to the Word of God, which speaks so much more clearly and does so much more than just God exists, and he must be just majestic and powerful. You see, the law of the Lord is perfect. What does it do? It converts the soul. It starts off with salvation. God might get your attention to draw closer to him through his creation, to get you to a point where he can speak to you through his word and save your soul, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure. It makes wise the simple. It rejoices the heart. It enlightens the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Verse 10, more to be desired are they than gold, even at today's spot gold price, yea, than much fine gold, and sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. It's more to be desired than, what are those cookies you just made? What are they? Snickerdoodles. Still warm. They were just made today. Sweeter even than the snickerdoodles and the honeycomb. And moreover, by them is thy servant warned, and in keeping of them there is great reward. And so in that psalm, Psalm 19, we go from the general revelation of God just saying, hey, let me get your attention. And then when you turn aside, it transitions from that to speaking very clearly to do a myriad of things in your life, first to save your soul and then give you direction beyond that, and to warn and to bring rewards, as I believe Moses was rewarded for the labors he did unto the Lord. The general revelation of God is all around us. You can't hide yourself. Again, Romans 1, you can't hide yourself from God the Creator because you live in His creation. But the special revelation of God to you, God speaking to you through His Word, it requires us to turn aside to see. Don't get frustrated with God's extended season of testing and preparation in your life. You know, you might be within a 40-year period, however many years, daily, weekly, routinely, working to build spiritual muscle memory. And I just think of all the things that Moses did on a daily basis for 40 years, it just got built into his psyche. So that when he was stressed doing it with hundreds and thousands of God's people, God's flock, some of the things he dealt with, it was just, they need water. They need food. Water from a rock is what they need. And it leads to that. And they need leadership. I just need to lead the flock. I need to lead the flock. I need to keep the flock. I need to provide oversight to the flock. So many things were built in to his spiritual muscle memory from this long period of life. And that could be what God is doing in your life right now, just day after day after day. He's building in this spiritual muscle memory. This is how I respond in this situation. This is what I do today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day. I read the Word of God. I speak to God in prayer. I share my faith. I assemble with the brethren. So that those things, when you're in this next season of life, whatever that might be for you, those things will just be somewhat automatic, so you can deal with things maybe you haven't dealt with before as God allows. So you could be in this period. Don't get frustrated however long it might be, but don't miss when God's trying to get your attention. And he's waiting for you maybe to now turn aside before he gives some specific tasking. Labor in his word and listen and act. And it was nerve-wracking for Moses to receive the special instructions that God gave him. We read about that as you continue on in the book of Exodus. But we shouldn't be so afraid of that part of the process. I don't want to get to that part of him telling me what he wants to do in my life, because I'm sure it's going to be something I know I can't do, and he's going to have to just work extra hard to just carry me through that. Don't be so afraid of that you won't turn aside. Make a decision to turn aside and do it promptly and immediately. Moses spent the final season of his life, then those final 40 years, discovering what God could do with a meek and humble servant. And it was the preparation of the middle 40 years that led to that. Moses said, I will, a choice, now, a time, turn aside, and action. I will now turn aside. The question is, will you? Will you?